Hi, I'm Catrina Peters from the Nevada Department of Agriculture. Today we're talking about the Nevada school meal pattern and how it's improving school meals statewide. By now, you've probably seen this commercial talking about the benefits of healthier school meals. And you've probably heard a lot about the new meal pattern from parents, teachers, and from school nutrition folks at the Nevada Department of Agriculture. With all the changes to the new meal pattern, there have been a lot of questions about whole grains. Today, we'll be discussing the grain requirements, and starting this school year, all grains offered must be whole grain rich for both lunch and breakfast. But what's a whole grain? A whole grain consists of the entire cereal grain seed or kernel and presents the most complete nutritional package. The kernel has three parts: the bran, which is the outer shell that protects the seed, the endosperm provides energy, and the germ that provides nourishment for the seed. Each part provides specific nutrients that are important for good health. Usually the kernel is cracked, crushed, or flaked during the milling process. If the finished product retains the same relative proportions of bran, germ, and endosperm as the original grain, it's considered a whole grain. For many whole grains, the word whole is usually listed before the type of grain. For example, whole wheat flour, whole grain barley, whole cornmeal, or whole white wheat. Even if the word whole isn't listed first, it could still be a whole grain. Words like berries and groats can also mean whole grain. Rolled oats, oatmeal, brown rice, quinoa, and buckwheat are also whole grains. What does whole grain rich mean? All grain offerings have to be whole grain rich, which means 50% of grains in a specific product have to be whole, and the remaining grains can be enriched. Keep in mind, 100% whole grain products qualify as whole grain rich, but they are not required. What about refined grains? Refined grains are milled to remove part or all of the bran and or germ. Most refined grains are enriched to add back some of the iron, thiamine, niacin, and riboflavin that are lost in the milling process. The nutrients are present in whole grains, so there's no need to enrich whole grains. If you see these terms, they are not whole grains. Enriched, degerminated, bran, wheat germ, pearled barley, grits, farina, and corn treated with lime. Any grain that is not a whole grain and not enriched is a non-creditable grain. Ready-to-eat cereals are notorious for lots of non-creditable grain-type ingredients like bran. But because cereal is usually fortified, those non-creditable grains become creditable because they are fortified. So why should we eat more whole grains? Whole grains contain fiber, vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. Fiber even helps children feel full longer. Whole grains may even reduce the risk of several chronic diseases, including coronary heart disease, and may help maintain a healthy weight. But how do you know if an item meets whole grain rich criteria? Schools can use this checklist from USDA. Whole grain rich foods must meet both of the following. The first, a serving of the food item must meet portion size requirements as defined in the Food and Nutrition Service guidelines. The food must also be at least one of the following. The product ingredient lists a whole grain as the first ingredient other than water. The grains per serving must be greater than or equal to 8 grams. The product includes the following FDA-approved health claim on its packaging. Diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol may reduce the risk of heart disease and some cancers. What's the minimum portion size for crediting? For items in Group A through G, they need at least 4 grams of grain to credit, based on 16 grams per ounce equivalent. Those items include breads, pizza crust, tortillas, pancakes, and cookies. For items in Groups H and I, it needs at least 7 grams, based on 28 grams per ounce equivalent. Those items include pasta, rice, and ready-to-eat cereals. Now that you've mastered whole grain and whole grain rich criteria, how do you determine the portion size that you need to serve? It depends on the food that will be served. Grains are categorized by group, which determines their portion size for crediting. The grain equivalency chart for crediting, including the grain groups, can be found at the web address on the screen. Click on the Grains Breads tab for the chart. What if I still can't determine what the correct portion size is from the grain chart? Ask for a product formulation statement. This sheet identifies the whole grain rich creditable and non-creditable grain per serving. Manufacturers must list ingredients in descending order by weight. Look for products that list whole grains first. If the food label isn't clear on whole grains, a product formulation statement is the preferred documentation you will need for crediting and for administrative reviews. If this form is not available, you can also use the manufacturer's actual recipe with ingredients listed by weight and volume, a USDA authorized child nutrition label for entree items that include grains, or a USDA Foods fact sheet for USDA foods. If you're unsure if a product meets whole grain rich criteria, contact the Nevada Department of Agriculture Food and Nutrition Division. Any questions?